Welcome to the Week 6 wide receiver and cornerback matchup grades. I'm Jason Gilbo at JGilbo11, breaking down the best and the worst of the week for wide receivers and their individual matchups with cornerbacks. Good week here. A lot of good passing attacks in good spots. You got Washington. You got game in the Superdome down with Detroit and New Orleans. You got Brady against the Jets. So some good spots this week. Let's dive into things here. We're going to talk Larry Fitzgerald here first, take on Robert McClain out of the slot. Fitzgerald's been a guy we've talked about quite a bit this year, just given the fact that he's been in a lot of good matchups, yet the only real game that he's done anything has been against Dallas. He did that touchdown in overtime against the 49ers, but outside that, he's been pretty quiet in a lot of good matchups. And I think that just has a lot to do with the fact that they've been very inefficient inside the red zone. This offense really just isn't that great in general. But when you look at Fitz, I still think you can go back to the well here, especially on FanDuel where he's 6,600. Really nice bargain price on him there compared to the 68 on DK, where once again a little bit more pricey. But looking at McClain, 87% catch rate allowed. He's rated 111th by PFF this year, 0.32 fantasy points per route run. So good spot for Fitz to kind of kick things off. Big name here, Julio Jones. Back at practice, he's 100% healthy, it seems, just given the fact that, he's practicing fully. Going to take on Xavier Howard. Not a guy that we're really, looking at as a main core play this week, but I think Julio Jones is obviously an interesting high upside guy, especially if we can get that touchdown. You look at Miami, 29th in DVOA against wide receiver ones this year. Secondary really just been torched all season long. They've been really struggling. So I definitely don't mind some of these guys like Julio Jones, Sanusa. I think Taylor Gabriel is an interesting GPP dart throw. Especially if Miami can kind of funnel things basically towards the pass, because they have been such a good rush defense this year and going back to last year. So, we talked about that in slate breakdown. Russ, mentioned Matt Ryan could be a possible big week. So Julio Jones definitely has the matchup to go and get that upside. Looking on FanDuel, Emmanuel Sanders is going to take on Eli Apple this week. Apple's been a guy who, obviously he moved behind Dominique Rodgers-Cromartie. Then he walked out, not gonna play this week, got suspended. Eli Apple's been back in there. Apple bottom 5 in PPR points allowed this year. This is a guy that we can continue to target with basically anyone. I think Sanders is an interesting play this week. Expect him to kind of go overlooked as well. Demaryius Thomas, this is going to be a guy I'll talk about later, but he's probably going to see a little bit more Janoris Jenkins, which is a guy I just don't usually like to target. So good spot for Sanders. Denver, once again, team total right around 26, 27. A good spot this week at home against the Giants team that's just been, god awful, and their season's pretty much done. So moving along here, Colton Tate. He's not going to see the two main corners there in New Orleans. Instead, he's going to see Kenny Vaccaro. This is a good spot for Tate out of the slot. Carl's been a guy who's allowed over 0.40 fantasy points per route run, over a 70% catch rate. He's also being targeted 25% of the time. So definitely going to be looking at Tate this week. I like his price tag on DraftKings, given the PPR, 6,800. I know people are going to say it's a little expensive for a guy who doesn't score a lot of touchdowns, but a good spot in a game where Vegas has him, looking to be behind some of it, which I'm not buying a ton of stock in. But definitely should be some points in that one again. So going to be looking at Tate this week. Decent price on both sites in that mid-range. Going to be going with him just given the fact that he's played pretty well this year. Stafford's, playing well. They should be throwing as well this week. So good spot for Tate. Definitely don't mind him. Moving on here, Devontae Adams. Good spot. I mean, Xavier Rhodes is going to be shadowing Jordy Nelson. Not really, looking to use Randall Cobb all that much in an average matchup. I think he's a decent play for kind of looking as more of a pivot away from some of the other popular names. I think Adams obviously the most intriguing given the fact that he's going to see Trey Waynes. Waynes is being targeted 22% of the time, the most among Minnesota cornerbacks. 0.36 fantasy points per route run allowed, definitely below average. So Devontae Adams in a good spot. In that same game, Stephon Diggs, not sure he's going to be even really 100% ready to go. Would not be surprised me to see if he sits or he's limited. It would surprise me to see if he's 100% healthy this week. I kind of like Thielen here as, a decent guy you can toss into some GPPs. I mean, maybe a borderline cash game at his price tag on FanDuel as a wide receiver 3. You look at Quentin Rollins, he's a slot corner there, 79% catch rate allowed, 0.41 fantasy points per route run. Thielen, obviously the second most targeted wide receiver in Minnesota, above 70% catch rate. Thielen's obviously one of the stronger, slot wide receivers in the game. And once again, I mean, if Diggs is out, I can definitely see him getting upgrading targets, as well as Kyle Rudolph. So wouldn't mind him. Just going to be a situation that we keep an eye on moving forward. Antonio Brown, coming off a 19-target game, obviously someone that we target week in and week out. Going to see Terrence Mitchell this week, who's being targeted 23% of the time. Kansas City, 22nd DVOA against wide receiver ones, allowing over 80 yards per game this season. So Brown's in a favorable spot. It's just a matter of the Steelers can get the ball moving and kind of get things spread out a little bit. We've kind of seen everything basically been, Brown's had a couple big weeks. Bell's been quiet for most of the season outside of the game against Baltimore. So, we haven't really yet to see the complete package. Deshaun Jackson, definitely a top play this week, going up against an Arizona secondary that's, basically been torched by wide receiver twos, wide receiver threes. You look at Justin Bethel, he's allowed 0.43 fantasy points per route this season. Deshaun Jackson's been a guy I don't mind targeting. He's been kind of trustworthy here. He's sitting about 7.5 targets per game. As far as a wide receiver two goes against Arizona, I mean, they're just all the targets are just funneling to wide receiver twos, wide receiver threes, because Patrick Peterson, who I'll talk about why in a little bit, but Jackson definitely a preferred play in a matchup that's actually pretty sneaky for a possible Tampa Bay stack that really actually maybe not doesn't even include Mike Evans. So good spot for Jackson this week. Another guy kind of cheapish, Terrell Pryor, been pretty quiet. Could have a breakout game here against the 49ers secondary. Dante Johnson has allowed 0.37 fantasy points per route, over 2 yards per route covered this year. When you look at Pryor, I mean, we haven't really seen the upside out of him. He hasn't seen a ton of targets out of that first week. But on the cheaper side, with a team total of about 4 touchdowns, I like Pryor here. I like Cousins a lot. It's just going to be a matter of nailing those guys. Jordan Reed's going to be back healthy this week. I know Chris Thompson's going to get some looks out of the backfield. So Kirk Cousins, it might be the best way to just kind of get that exposure to that passing attack. But I definitely don't mind Terrell Pryor this week either. Looking at the Browns, 32nd DVOA against wide receiver ones. AJ Green, T.Y. Hilton, Antonio Brown have all torched this. Now they're going to face another top-end wideout, DeAndre Hopkins. Hopkins obviously getting hammered with targets because he's not exactly been, efficient. It's 50% catch rate, only 0.34 fantasy points per route run. But Hopkins obviously has been one of the better fantasy wide receivers. Same with Watson. I expect them to be a pretty popular pairing. Look at Will Fuller this week. I know people are going to be like, oh, he's scored a couple touchdowns on minimal targets, minimal receptions, regression, yes. But this is actually a really good spot for him against Jamar Taylor, who's been absolutely torched this year. So keep an eye on him as kind of that cheaper stacking option. Or if you want to go Hopkins, Watson, Fuller, all three, I definitely don't mind that either. Middle range guys, not a ton to talk about. There's kind of some guys floating around in average spots. Randall Cobb's one of them against Terrence Newman. Newman's not a bad corner. He's pretty average in terms of his stats allowed. Randall Cobb obviously got one of the cheaper guys this week. Basically, you're just kind of hoping that Green Bay's passing attack just still rolling and still can get it done even on the road against Minnesota, and you're expecting Xavier Rhodes to basically take Nelson out of play, so that would kind of funnel things down to Cobb and tight ends and Devontae Adams. But Devontae Adams is the preferred one here. I think Randall Cobb's an interesting play, more of a pivot away from some of those cheaper names. I don't expect him to be really all that popular this week. Keenan Allen's another one. Priced up quite a bit on DraftKings. He's 7,900, 72 on FanDuel. He's kind of in a similar spot as Cobb, just more pricey. TJ Carey hasn't really been bad this year. He is being targeted quite a bit, still allowing a 60% catch rate. When you look at Allen, I mean, targeting over 25% of the time in terms of his passing attack, also averaging 0.39 fantasy points per route run. So this is kind of more about Allen being very solid and productive this year, more than kind of Carey's been bad. So kind of an even matchup there. I do like San Diego here this week. I think their passing attack is a little bit underrated, will be overlooked as well. Jarvis Landry's another one. Going to see Brian Poole out of the slot. Poole's not bad. They do kind of limit, but also allowing a 70% catch rate. Devontae Parker, if healthy. Right now, it says Robert Alford's going to be on him, Atlanta's worst cornerback, which would mean that Desmond Trufant would be on Kenny Stills, which is a little bit weird, but it doesn't look like a shadow situation at the moment. If that does change, I mean, we'll look at it, but obviously I think the only downfall is obviously Jay Cutler under center. But Parker and Landry, once again, I mean, if they can get any garbage time, which I don't even know what they can get at this point, they would be in play. Chris Hogan, Brandon Cooks, Morris Claiborne's actually been really solid this year. He's going to shout out Brandon Cooks this week. Darryl Roberts is going to see Chris Hogan. I still think Cooks is worthy of a dart throw in a GPP or two. Hogan, price tag's coming up. Once again, he's been a guy who's scoring a ton of touchdowns, due for a little bit of touchdown regression. When you look at things here, DVOA, 21st against wide receiver ones, 11th against wide receiver twos. Hard to kind of decipher what that is in New England at this point. I mean, Hogan's kind of been that guy. We talked about it as well, where Russ said, put the primary focus on Hogan, and Cooks is going to get a game here or there, but don't mind him in GPPs. There's always that upside for both of them in this passing attack. It's just not, really a great matchup. It's not a bad one either. San Francisco, better spot here. Washington secondary not as appealing, given the fact that they lost Josh Norman for a couple of weeks. Pierre Garçon going to see Quinton Dunbar, who's on left side, average corner at best. Look at what Garçon's doing this year. 70% catch rate, 0.37 fantasy points per route run. Pretty strong numbers for this guy. Expect him to kind of put up these numbers. A little bit overpriced on DraftKings from what I think where he should be, probably in the mid fives. 6,800 on FanDuel, not a bad price, but you're not really getting a discount on Garçon anymore. To the lockdown coverage, to the guys I'm not really targeting this week, we'll start with Xavier Rhodes, shadowing Jordy Nelson. Not a good spot for Jordy. Jordy's once again dealing with some injuries, but when you look at Rhodes, I mean, not being target less than 16%, allowing less than a 50% catch rate. Just a guy I'm not really looking to target this week. Demaryius Thomas, he's another one I prefer. Sanders, I prefer the running game. Janoris Jenkins, another one I don't pick on. 43% catch rate allowed, 0.18 fantasy points per route run against. With Thomas, I think there's going to be certain weeks to use him. This week, probably not going to be going that route. Sammy Watkins, no, we're not going with him. AJ Bouye looking to cover him. Jalen Ramsey's going to be on the outside with Robert Woods. Cooper Kupp's drawing the slot man, but this is still a bad spot for this Rams offense. I mean, once again, Jacksonville's secondary is just not something that we're really looking to target. Michael Thomas, this one's interesting because Darius Slay, who's been very, very strong, over the last year or so, held Odell Beckham, whether he was healthy or not that game. Julio Jones, he held Kelvin Benjamin, all three of those guys under 60 yards, being shadowed by Darius Slay. I do think he's one of the better shutdown corners in the game. You look at his numbers, I mean, holding guys to under a 0.28 fantasy points per run, under a 60% catch rate. So Michael Thomas going to see plenty of him this week. Interesting to see if that kind of gets going because Thomas, shut down by Xavier Rhodes earlier this year, bounced back last couple of weeks. I don't see a ton of upside in this spot here. Raiders guys, Amari Cooper, going to see Trevor Williams while Michael Crabtree is going to be shadowed by Casey Hayward. Hayward's definitely been the best corner there. Trevor Williams hasn't done a bad job filling in against wide receiver twos, so I'm not overly thrilled with either of these matchups. I think Cooper's worth a dart throw at his price tag. Crabtree, I'll stay the same. I'm not going to have a lot, probably just more of a slate-dependent thing if you're going that route. I think this is actually kind of a tougher spot, especially if Derek Carr doesn't play, but it looks like he's leaning towards it. But I think they're really just more tournament plays at most this week. So let's talk the big showdown, Mike Evans, Patrick Peterson. Evans saw 18 targets last time these two played, and these two guys saw each other. That was mainly because Tampa Bay was down 24-0 at the half. He only finished with a 6 for 70 in one line. I mean, inefficient. He caught 6 of his 18 targets. When you look at things, I don't think we're going to see 12, 13 plus targets for Evans this week. Peterson, he shadowed Hilton, Des Bryant, Pierre Garçon, Alshon Jeffrey. None of those guys went over 30 yards. Only Jeffrey went over 20 yards. He's just been that guy. Everything funnels elsewhere. So that's why Deshaun Jackson, if you want to roll a dice on Adam Humphries, I'm not against that. So in those matchups with those guys, 9 total targets went to them. So that's kind of where you see things with this Arizona secondary. Everything's really limited towards Patrick Pearson, and then it just moves away, and there's some success there. So for the Bucs, if they're wise, they're going to be running the ball. They're going to be getting away from Patrick Pearson because that's where the success has happened this year. So that's going to wrap it up for me. If I missed someone that you're looking at this week, shoot me a Twitter mention. Pop one in the comment for me, and I'll get back to you. Otherwise, you can head over to DaveFantasyCafe.com. My article is up as well. And good luck in week 6.